Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. Today we have special guest, curator and historian, Sadiah Boonstra. Hi, Sadiah, how are you doing?
Hey, Shamnung, nice to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Lovely to see you. Oh, thanks so much for
Yeah.
being here. I'm really excited to dive into talking about your work as a curator, functioning all around the world in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and in Australia as well. But first of all, I might ask, how did you get to what you do now, and what is it that you do?
Yeah, right. Okay. So, like you said, I'm a curator and a historian. So, first, actually, I was a historian and then I became a curator. Um, so, I've always sort of been like this history nerd, like, always been interested in old stories and things like that, like from since I was a kid, actually. And then I also got interested in art. That was also always there. Arts, performing arts. I love dance and music. Um, so I decided to study history. So I did a master's in history. And actually, back then, I was very much interested in like the ancient Greek history and Persian history and things like that. And that's also how I got interested in museums, actually. I love going to museums and sort of experience history actually in a museum. So that was how history sort of came alive for me. So then I thought, I was curious to understand how people made exhibitions, what curators do, and how they do it. So I did another master's degree in curatorial studies. And that is actually when my career kind of started, because a part of that studies was that I would do intern like 1 year in a museum as a curator assistant. So I ended up in the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam, and that is actually where I really got into this curation thing. It was also where I was introduced to issues of colonialism, post-colonial discourse, marginalized communities and people. So that was really sort of the starting point for me. Um, the Tropen Museum in Amsterdam was founded as a colonial museum. So the biggest part of the collection was actually from Indonesia in the context of the Netherlands. Indonesia was the main colony of the Netherlands for 300 years. Um, so that was for me really kind of like this starting point to get into this part of history after being immersed in ancient Greek history and then sort of like move into this colonial part of history. You can really cannot escape it in that museum. And what I noticed there and also in other museums is that you see all these objects, really beautiful art and other artifacts, but I was always wondering, where are the people, who have made these objects, who have played these instruments that were on display, or who have been carrying all these objects and created those artifacts. So that is what I was very interested in. So that turned into sort of like an interest in storytelling and intangible heritage, and that became my PhD topic. So my PhD was about the creation of intangible heritage in Indonesia. So I chose the wayang theater, so the puppet theater of Indonesia, as a case study, and I traced how colonial discourses about wayang influenced the way in which people are still talking about wayang as UNESCO heritage. Then at the other side, I was also really interested, how do puppeteers, contemporary puppeteers, actually deal with heritage? So how do they create their own shows, their practices? How do they develop that? And how do they respond to issues of heritage? So there was always like this idea of history and tradition, but also, how does that work out in the present? That has always been um, yeah, an issue for me and an interest. Like, how does the past actually play out in the present? How is it influencing the way that we live, the way that we are, and how the world is today? So yeah, and throughout my PhD, I was also getting more involved in kind of programming things, because a lot of my colleagues and I, we were doing this research, but and then you acquire all this knowledge. but it's kind of useless if you don't really share that, or if you don't really apply that in practice. So for me,
Yeah.
programming became a way to to open up the conversation to a wider public, I think. So
Right, and
that's kind
actually,
of
like
like,
when the public goes to a museum, you want to ensure that they're engaging with the work in a meaningful way, rather than just
mm,
like have the objects, have the people, and call it a day.
yes, exactly. Yeah, that you create some interaction between the things that you see on display, and that audiences can also have a voice, and that you can also discuss with them, bring up issues that are actually important behind the scenes, that you also bring that forward to sharing to an audience.
So I think you've kind of answered this question of why curation is important implicitly by talking about the way that you're connecting the past to the present and inviting audiences to actually engage with that question. What's the actual process, or what's the approach that you take when you're dealing with an exhibition or a piece of programming?
um, I guess for me, curation is very much a process also of facilitation. um, Maybe I can give an example, like a more concrete example. So earlier this year, I curated the public programs for Asia Topa. And Asia Topa, as you know, but maybe others not, is performing arts festival for the Asia Pacific, located based in Melbourne. And I was invited to curate the public programs and craft um, artist talks, workshops, events, whatever I found interesting or important to share with audiences. And I did a lot of research. Of course, I was introduced to all the amazing artists that participated in Asia Topa, and I was given the opportunity to create something to connect to the audiences. So while doing my research, what I noticed is that all these artists, everyone has a story to tell. So that's basically what they're doing. They're sharing a story in through an art form. So it can be dance or music or theater, but basically it's a story. It's their life story or part of their life stories. That is what they're sharing. And interestingly, I started to notice a lot of not necessarily overlap, but more points of connections between the works and the artists. And since the focus was on Asia Pacific, I thought, I wanted to amplify. I wanted to amplify the voices of the artists. I wanted to show that these artists, they don't live in a vacuum. They're really located and situated in real life situations that might be really different than the Australian situation, maybe. So I wanted to sort of like bring that connection and show that these artists are actual people. They're creating things. They're living in a way, and I feel that we are all humans. So I think that gives us the possibility to be able to connect through emotions, through experiences and feelings and similarities. So. So for me, for example, the Asia Topa one was very much about amplifying voices and, opening up broader issues that are playing in the region that might not necessarily be the same in Australia. So to sort of like flesh out these kind of themes and topics that play out in the region and connect them to Melbourne and Asia Topa audiences.
I love that that
Yeah,
connects really well with what you said earlier of walking through a museum, seeing these objects and asking where are the people. And then,
yeah,
here we
yeah,
have
yeah,
a living culture and a local contemporary context. And
yeah,
being able to amplify those voices in your position is wonderful. I would love to ask, because you've done work in so many different geographic places, and
mm,
you're trying to present these different, often Southeast Asian cultures and contexts to
yeah.
different audiences. What's that like? What's the, I guess, like feeling of working in different places like Southeast Asia, Europe, and Australia? Are there unique challenges to each place, or unique affordances?
Yeah, I guess the interesting thing for me is definitely that every place is very very different. But since I'm this historian with this curiosity about how history plays out in the present. So for me, a large part of that is also colonialism and colonial structures that might still work through in contemporary life across the globe, actually. So So that is quite interesting to see how colonial history plays out differently in different parts of the world. So, I grew up in the Netherlands, so there it's sort of like part of life, but all of the other places, like in London, where I curated an exhibition at the British Museum, and in Melbourne, for example, the colonial history is different. And it's interesting how that also sort of like influences the audiences and the public. And for example, in the Netherlands, when I was doing my research on wayang, everybody in the Netherlands, everybody knows what is wayang. They know that it's a puppet theater. They know they can immediately imagine a puppet, for example. But in London, that's not the case. Like when I was working with a curator in the British Museum, they had like this amazing collection of 200 puppets collected by Stamford Raffles. So most of those puppets had been sleeping for 200 years in the storage spaces, and they'd never seen the day of light. And we were, lucky enough to be creating this exhibition and bring them out. But it was a totally different kind of like point of access that we needed to provide for the audiences, because there nobody would know what is wayang. Probably they might also not necessarily care about that because it's Indonesia. There's no historical relationship necessarily between the UK and Indonesia. So then you have to sort of like really think about how can we tell the story that we want to tell to audiences who might not be familiar with a particular topic.
I'm really also curious about whether, I spent 6 years in Jakarta growing up, and
Yeah.
even, I guess, being born in Australia, coming in, going to an international school, my engagement with Indonesian culture was still that of an outsider perspective, even as I was living there for so long. And so my understanding of wayang and wayang kulit is very much that, like, oh, we would go on a field trip to understand this thing. It's not the embedded knowledge. It's not the lived craft or culture.
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, presenting it to like a UK or an Australian audience must be so tricky to convey that feeling or that process.
Yeah. And what does help these days, of course, is technology. You can show videos and things like that to also show that traditions like that. And even though the British Museum had these old puppets, and then people are inclined to think that this is a tradition that was happening 200 years ago, but it's actually still very much alive and around. So luckily these days, we have video, we can make videos, we can show videos or create, interactive games or whatever to also find other entry points for the audience to sort of introduce them to a new topic.
So you've been working with museums and galleries for a long time. These institutions are implicitly placed in positions of colonial power a lot of the time, right? They reinforce the structure of, well, often they're filled with stolen objects for one thing, but also just like the notion of, we're going to put your culture into the box and get everyone to look at it as we present it to you as the experts. First of all, yeah, do you have any perspective on the how we decolonize a museum space, or go around these colonial positionalities or perspectives?
Right. Yeah. That's a really important question, and I think that will be a question that I will probably deal with for my whole career, probably, because yeah, like you say, like this coloniality of power is very much embedded in the museum, but actually also the museum was kind of like a founding structure to even convey this dominant power of Eurocentric colonialism. So the museum actually played a really big part in that, in the way that they collected objects, in the way that they presented objects, and therefore, the people that were attached to it. So, and often, in the 19th century also, actually real life people that were on display from colonized parts of the world. There were exhibitions of actually of people. So, that was a very literal way to do that, and to display the power of European nations over others, because they
Yeah,
had the power to
presumably
actually yeah.
that's not what you meant by like where are the people. You don't mean put the people on the
No,
exhibition
no,
plate.
definitely not. No, no. No, that is not what I meant with where are the people in the museum. For sure not. No, for me, in this case, it would be like, wow, that is crazy that, that a certain group of people think that they have, they had the power, and they think they can display other people as objects, as artifacts. So that's super problematic, of course. So yeah, so the display of actual live people, that doesn't happen anymore. But the displaying of artifacts, etc., it's still kind of like the same dynamic. And to me, to sort of like go around this coloniality of power, I think is really hard, because these power structures are very much ingrained and embedded in the social fabric of our world. So that's actually what Edward Said calls like the cultural archive. It's ingrained in our societies, it's ingrained in our politics, in our culture, it's institutionalized, and it's systemic. So that is still there. So how do you go around it? Is, to me, that's maybe also how I try to curate. It's about trying to listen to other stories, to other histories, to other experiences that might that counter this coloniality of power. So there are other ways of being and living, and a lot of people actually live in other sort of like realities. And it's about listening to their stories and their experiences, and in creating exhibitions together, for example, or to do research together, so that it's not just one dominant perspective that looks at someone else, but that you do something, that you can create a new narrative, a new histories together.
So it sounds like for you, one of the most important things to counter the implicit colonial structures of the museum
Yeah.
is to work together with people to present their histories and
Yes. Yeah.
cosmologies.
Yeah. And I also think like yeah, for example, like I now still have an exhibition running in Amsterdam at Framed. It's called On the Nature of Botanical Gardens. So it explores the colonial roots of the botanical gardens. So,
Good pun.
usually people would think, yeah, botanical gardens, oh, beautiful gardens, beautiful flowers and plants and whatnot, and maybe knowledge, but it's usually instinctively associated with like a leisure kind of place. But it has deep colonial roots, because they created an infrastructure for the trade of plants, for example. They were places for experimenting, for bringing over non-local plants, trees, etc., and then to use that to actually for economic exploitation. So, for example, in Indonesia, the most famous botanical garden is in Bogor. Tea was introduced to Indonesia. It's not a native plant to Indonesia, through the botanical gardens. And then, the Dutch colonizers could develop huge tea plantations and, reap the economic benefits of that. So that is all implicit in those botanical gardens, actually. So what I did is to sort of like try to critically look at this on the nature of botanical gardens. Is I did research, and I just found a lot of artists who were actually already dealing with issues like that. And I found artists who were exploring, or who were actually living in a completely other realities of how we perceive nature. For, in the Eurocentric colonial gaze, the nature is very much far removed from people, but there are other ways of being where people are actually more part of nature. So for me, that one was also, again, like to sort of like pull those different voices together and provide a platform for that, and show that there are so many different perspectives, so many different ways of being and thinking, that that I try to do that. So I think it's also about that, like really listening to other voices and other stories and experiences, and sharing that with the larger public.
What I love about that explanation of what you're doing with this exhibition that's still on, as well as earlier your Asia Topa, I guess, public programming, is that you're saying that there are artists, there are people who are already doing this investigation,
Yeah.
doing interesting work, and you are giving a platform and amplifying and exposing the public to them and them to the public. To me, from my limited perspective, that sounds like the mark of a really good curator, because it acknowledges that that people already are doing that work, and then you get to point
Right.
at them. One of the problems that I think occurs a lot of the time in big institutions is this cry of like, oh, where are we going to find the people of color? Or like, where are we going to find someone doing XYZ? They exist, and you just aren't aware of them. At least that's my take on it.
Yeah. No, that's definitely true. If it's so hard to, if institutions find it hard to find people of color, then I think they're not looking hard enough, because they're everywhere, and there are so many people who do really important and really cool stuff. So it's a matter of, then it just means that your circle is too narrow. So you should go beyond that, and just find connections.
So I'd love to ask this question very much related to the stuff we've been talking about, which is a two-parter. The first part is, have you experienced difficulties in navigating the hierarchical structures that exist, that trickle through the relationships of cultural production and curation? Have you found difficulties in working with institutions?
I guess maybe not necessarily for me, at least, on a personal level, as an experience. The challenges sometimes are that, in the university, for example, or in the museum, like both. I'm very often, the only person of color who's a lecturer, the only person of color who is in the room talking about programming, or even of the exhibition, and that is something that I do notice very strongly in Europe, in the UK, but also in Melbourne. There is still like not enough people of color around to talk about Asia, or who are involved in those discussions. So that is definitely something that I do notice, and then I'm usually like, sometimes it makes me sad, sometimes it makes me angry, depending on what kind of mood I am in, probably. But that's definitely something that I do notice, that I feel like the voices of people of color are still really very much underrepresented in institutions of, knowledge, like the university and the museum. I think there is really a lot of space for, to gain, I think. Yeah.
Which leads into the second part of the question. Do you have any practical tips of how we might overcome those difficulties structurally or individually?
Yeah, I think, to me, it feels like it should really be a commitment. It's a commitment from an institution. Like, there is always so much talk about diversity, opening up to people of color and whatever. But so that should, from that should result that you actually make a commitment to do that. So, the argument is very often, we want to only hire the best. Well, sometimes you also need to give someone who is talented an opportunity to actually grow and develop into a position that maybe at first this person might not be necessarily ready for, but then take the time and commitment to groom and coach this person, train this person, to get there, and actually also like actively give up positions of power for people of color, because otherwise that's the only way to change institutions in a systemic way. It's really about the commitment and giving up, places and positions of power to people of color.
That's super well said. I think it's so tricky. A lot of the conversations happening in boardrooms around at least Australia, are like, how much power do we give? And like, how do we give power while retaining power ourselves, right? Implicitly.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. How can we
It's
give
like,
power without giving up our power?
yeah. Well, let's
Yeah.
just generate some more. And
Yeah.
it's really like, uh, I think that there's not the same level of commitment that you're talking about, or maybe even understanding of what is being asked
Yeah.
of these institutions.
Yeah, and also, I don't think Australia is the only country who's dealing that is dealing with issues like this. That this is taking place all over the world. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement is gaining so much momentum because of that, because it's real in so many parts around the globe. So Australia is definitely not alone in that. I think there, in the Netherlands and the UK for sure, there is so much room for improvement in that respect.
Are there places or institutions that you can point to that you thought have done well, either in a micro or macro scale?
To be honest, when I was curating the exhibition in Amsterdam at Frame and Framed, I was really pleasantly surprised at the diversity of their team. Like everyone is a person of color, and like a crazy mix of different ethnicities and nationalities, which is really interesting, because you get to hear, so many stories about life experiences from across the globe, and which, over lunchtime, over sharing, a sandwich. So, and that opens up also your perspective about what's happening in other parts of the world, but also, all of those, everything is so connected. So you find that in one place in Amsterdam, which I find really inspiring.
That's fantastic. And then leading into maybe our final question, which is, if you could conceptualize a project that you would love to work on, maybe in terms of like, oh, you want to work in this area or on this subject matter at this institution with this particular team, what would that look like?
Ooh, that's very tough.
Yeah, it's a tough
I
one.
think, yeah. I guess, like, I don't have just one particular project in mind, but there are still a few research projects that I really would like to do, which also deal with decoloniality in Indonesia, and um, actually the main thing that I want to look at is, how can we think of, um, for example, issues like tradition versus contemporary in a different way. Contemporary is also another label. How can we think about contemporary artists who do relate to history or to, traditions of dance, music, knowledge, that have been around for centuries? How can we talk about that in a different way, in a more equal and respectful way that is more apt for the situation that they live and work in?
That sounds awesome. And yeah, I'm so keen to see what comes out of those explorations. As you said, things that are
Yeah,
probably going to be themes throughout your entire career.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
been such a pleasure. I'm so glad that we got to chat today. It's really great to be able to talk about curation and tradition and the present, the past and the present, and how they connect different contexts globally. Thank you so much for your keen insights.
Thank you so much, Shang Noon, for having me. It was really really a lot of fun to prepare and also to have this conversation now.
Awesome. And if
Yeah.
people want to check out your work, they can visit your website, is right?
Yes, my website. I just, that was one of the COVID projects, actually, sadiahcurates.com.
There it
Oh
is.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, great.
And
Yeah,
you've got you can follow Sadiah also on Twitter and Instagram at Sadiah Curates.
yeah, thanks.
Fantastic. All right, take care and see you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Great
Bye.
pleasure. Bye. Awesome. You're watching The Distillery in a series of online interviews. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun. There are new episodes daily, and you should check back, but you can also find out future guests and previous episodes on our website, distillery.site, and follow us on Instagram at distillery.site and Twitter at distillery site. Take care, everyone, and see you soon.